Hi, this is Alex Bryant, President of East West Associates. Thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to having you all today on a pretty interesting topic. We've got a lot of interest in this. We've been operating in Mexico since quite a while. I had a facility down there in 1995 down in Puebla. Obviously, we've got a lot of focus on Mexico. So we want to take this time, this hour, by looking at Mexico as an option for you. We're going to kind of move forward through here. We've got as our agenda with a brief introduction of East West, so people know who we are. For those who don't, go through our webinar series, introduction to speakers, then a review of why manufacturers are relocating out of China, because that's having a direct impact on Mexico. As the invitation talked about, we'll go through 3 case studies directly impacting Mexico, and then we're going to look at the Q&A discussion. And the way for those, we've got a number of new companies on here today, but for those who were on the Q&A discussion, those who are new, the Q&A discussion will take up about 40 to 45 minutes of the presentation. And it should be an interesting discussion. And everyone who wants to ask questions, please ask questions. You can go onto your control panel, ask a question, it'll be sent to me. Sometimes we're not able to get to all the questions. For those we can't, we'll respond back to you with a phone call or an email the next day or 2 days at the latest. But it'll be an open conversation, so please feel free to ask questions. We've already got a number of questions in advance, and so we'll go through those and any questions you all have. So a brief discussion on East West Associates. We are an operational execution firm. We've been in business since 2005, so we're 19 years old. We assist clients who are operating on the ground in really 5 locations: China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Poland, Eastern Europe, and in the US. And we are active in really 4 areas. 1, global manufacturing supply chain footprint. That's directly touching what we're going to be talking about today in Mexico. A lot of our clients look in Mexico both for sourcing, supply chain, contract manufacturing, as well as establishing manufacturing operations there. So when we're talking about global manufacturing supply chain footprints, a lot of global site selection, a lot of contract manufacturing, a number of plant closures. Many of those are in China now, and then getting site selection in Mexico and negotiating incentives in Mexico. Second area where we operate is really operational commercial performance, and that's for our clients, facilities and businesses in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Poland, and the US. A lot of that is due diligence and turnarounds. Third area, we focus on supply chain. That directly touches what we're going to be doing today in Mexico. We have every aspect of supply chain: identifying suppliers, qualifying suppliers, supplier performance improvement, supplier investigations, supplier transition. We are right now going through a supplier transition for a large elevator company that we're building out a supply chain base for them in Mexico. And the fourth area where we get involved in is human resources and risk management. And that's helping identify and qualify executives on the ground in Mexico, doing background checks and training. We also do a fair amount of interim general management, and that's really for our clients who have facilities on the ground in Mexico or businesses, and they need a senior person to run their company. Generally, that occurs when there's a risk, like a fraud or investigation. We have to fire the general manager, or they leave unexpectedly. So those are really the 4 areas where we get involved. Here's the 5 areas where we operate around the globe. Here, just a core representative sample of some of our clients. Many of them are working with in Mexico as well. Okay, so when we get to second aspect of is the webinar series. I think as everyone knows, we've got 6 webinars we're conducting in November and December. The today and Thursday are the first 2 on Mexico. The one next week is going to be on revealing feasibility studies, and that's going to be on really Mexico, Thailand, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and Poland, and it's primarily geared toward companies that are trying to deal with or develop an alternative strategy for addressing the current situation in China with the increased duties with the U.S.-China duty. We know they're going to be increased And we're trying to figure out how, but a lot of our clients are now trying to figure out how, where they should reestablish their reestablish their supply chain and their manufacturing outside of China because of the fear that the geopolitical tensions and the new administration, Trump administration, will be increasing duties and tariffs. So we're doing quite a bit of feasibility studies, and that's what that webinar is about. Then in December, we're doing one about China operations, diagnosing them because a number of them are struggling after COVID and after the loss of Western executives going to China and then Chinese executives come back here. A lot of those operations are struggling just for lack of involvement from the U.S. Then we've got another one on Mexico sourcing and supply chain, specifically in the metal industry. And then finally on December 11th, around global manufacturing and supply chain footprint. And that's primarily for clients who are reevaluating their global supply chain, their global manufacturing in order to get closer to customers, right? So if you have an interest, please feel free to drop us a note and we'll be happy to sign you up for any of those. As we move forward, the next is introduction of speakers, and we got a good set of speakers today. We did have one of our partners was not able to attend to Mexico due to a family emergency. We've got Dan McLeod and Jacob Miller, both of them were very active in Mexico for quite a while. Dan, I'll stop here and introduce you. And if you would introduce yourself and then Jacob.
Sure. Dan McLeod. My background is initially as an engineer and was involved in process engineering and then factory management, factory operations, and also managing capital projects for design, expansion, startup of new facilities. Over 20 years in Asia, split between China and Southeast Asia. And I've been working with Alex in East West for the last 6 years. And since then, in addition to projects in China, I've also been working on sourcing and supply chain development projects in Mexico and factory relocation and sourcing projects in Central Europe as well as China and Southeast Asia.
That's great.
I'm Jacob Miller. My background is also engineering, mechanical engineering. I spent basically 10 years in Mexico. I spent 20 years in Asia. And Mexico especially, I did a lot of things with technology transfer. And then I did a lot of interim management and then setting up operations and setting up suppliers and setting up sourcing offices and stuff for companies wanting to localize stuff in Mexico. I've been with East West, I think now for 3 or 4 years, and looking forward to talking to you guys more.
Great, thank you. Jacob, the facilities you put in Mexico, where are they located? They're in Querétaro?
Mostly either in the center of Mexico, the Querétaro, Mexico City, or Toluca area, and then also in the Monterrey area closer to the border.
Certainly, certainly. And the sourcing offices you set up, same areas?
Yes. I think more of my sourcing work has been done more in the central of Mexico because of the suppliers that are available there, more Mexico City, Puebla area, Toluca area, Querétaro area, and that kind of, basement center more than in the Monterrey area. I've had less luck there in a lot of projects, but it depends on the industry.
It does depend on the industry, and we continue to see that really because the industry sectors are spread out across Mexico, right? With the medical, all Tijuana, and then across the border. So it really depends on the industry sector. Okay, as we move forward, we're going to talk here first about manufacturers relocating out of China and why that's relevant to Mexico. For that, I'm going to turn to Dan McLeod. Dan, if you would take it away.
Sure. As background, just to sort of set the stage where we are, and certainly many of us on the phone here have, entered China either for manufacturing, sourcing, or both 15, 20 years ago. But during the last 15 years, we've seen headwinds against those operations. It started with rising labor costs in the early 2000s, where you were seeing double-digit increases annually. Initially, the regulatory complexity and the relative ease of establishing operations and running operations in China was a little more straightforward. Regulations have become more strict, and the enforcement of them have been either more stringent or more variable in recent years. That's created problems. Increased domestic competition. Many of you can appreciate this. When you went to China, you had a somewhat unique product, or it wasn't available in that domestic market. You were likely perhaps exporting, but also chasing that domestic market, and maybe have been successful for a while, but after a few years of operation, your technology, your know-how spread, and you found increased domestic competition, and followed by China 2025, which is essentially a targeted manufacturing strategy targeted at developing national champions in the manufacturing sector in key industries in China, and that has really sort of forced some international or international competitors out of the marketplace by due to preferential sourcing practices. And again, in the last several years, the trade tariffs, 7-8 years now, were in place, and a number of companies struggled to respond to that. Many successfully did, but at the expense of their margins. And this continues to be a concern, and certainly a high point of discussion these days. And then more recently, with the last few years with COVID-19 and the disruption to suppliers operations, logistics availability and cost, and just uncertainty in whether in being able to efficiently operate a global supply chain versus a regional supply chain. And then more recently, in the last 2 years, the economy in China has been greatly slowed, underreported generally, but targeting sources in country all the time. The concerns there are very deep, and the Chinese local domestic economy is struggling, and so with that, deflation and pricing pressures for all manufacturers there. Next slide. So if you're not looking at China, or you're concerned about being in China, where would you want to look at? Where are you going to go? East West did a survey of manufacturers in China and found that majority of them were looking at options to move outside of China, and where are they going to go? Many of them were looking at Southeast Asia, particularly. More recently, that numbers jumped up in India, and there's a great deal more interest in India these days. And then the second behind that is Mexico, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. Again, where countries have been concerned about the feasibility of a global supply chain, too many disruptions and unexpected costs and forecasted cost, and making localization or regionalization of supply chains more feasible, with Mexico being a target for that.
Just add on this slide, we can count and do mathematics. We know that average is up to more than 100, but people were able to put multiple responses on that. And so Mexico came in strongly in second behind Southeast Asia. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the EWA case studies on the presentation and the invitation that we sent to you all. There were 3 case studies we were going to look at. We talked about the invitation. Case study number 1 about the 3 scenarios. Case study number 2 about unbolting from China and relocating to Mexico, the supply chain. And case study number 3 was about closing U.S. plant to relocating to Mexico. So Dan, I will turn it over to you, and if you would walk us through those case studies.
Sure. Okay. The first case study is it was again a manufacturer, consumer products, and they had been operating in Illinois for many years, decades, and they had a fairly significant facility that they continued to grow, but they were seeing problems. They have been seeing problems with that operation. They were getting declining output. The assets were just getting too old, and it was hard to maintain, and they're seeing efficiencies drop. Wage rates were going up, and it was finding difficult to find and retain employees. So the labor situation they've struggled with, and they fortunately seen good growth in their business, and this had required them to outsource some of their process. So this was this limited their ability to manufacturing everything in-house and reduce their ability to insource. East West was engaged to look at some options for them. We looked at the possibility of relocating a factory and distribution center in the Southeast United States. Looked at partnering with an established manufacturer in Mexico to produce the product and ship back to the US for distribution, and then to establish a factory and distribution center with the factory in Mexico, and taking advantage of the lower labor costs and better availability of labor in Mexico. Next slide. So in the Southeast, we evaluated 10 states and got it down to 4 sites, looking at the client's primary criteria. We were able to interview state and regional local economic development entities, visit sites, and collect site-specific information on wage, utility, and property costs. So we were able to get a pretty good overall overview of available, not just available property, but labor pools and incentives, local incentives available throughout the country. In Mexico, we identified potential partners for them and looked at either a joint venture or a contracting relationship, and developing terms for that relationship and the economics associated with it for all the materials, utilities, labor overheads, and whatnot for operating the factory. Next slide. And third, again, the option to manufacture in Mexico. We evaluated multiple regions within the country and shortlisted that down to 5 cities, and developed budgetary costs for build to suit and modeled the operating cost. Also investigated the availability and capability of suppliers, and they would need metalworking and fabrication, injection molding, among other things, sophisticated coating and painting operations. So we were able to identify areas in the country where those suppliers could be available, and then develop budgetary cost estimates and model that, which included a distribution center in Texas to support the new operation. Next, Alex. And so the conclusion, what we saw from Mexico is really the advantage in their case was limited to labor savings. They produced a rather large and bulky product, so logistics costs would be high coming out of Mexico. What we did find is in the U.S., generally from a cost standpoint, factory construction, utilities, freight were all lower. So again, it was limited to a large labor savings and tariff avoidance working in Mexico. So we really didn't see a significant cost advantage in Mexico versus the Southeast. In the case of a contract manufacturer or a supplier, that was the less attractive alternative, so we focused on manufacturing itself. So as a takeaway from this, the client decided to move ahead with a strategy of relocating to Mexico, but first develop a supplier base over the next 1 to 3 years, and determining once successful and established, the plan is to then relocate manufacturing into Mexico when they've got a firm supplier base in place. Next.
Dave, we had a question pop up on utility consumption. Can you talk a little bit about difference utility consumption and utility pricing in Mexico and the U.S.?
Generally, and it can be more than this, and generally we're seeing plus 10% utility costs in Mexico. In this particular case, the client was a large consumer of natural gas, and that is much more limited availability in Mexico than you'd think in the U.S. And in the Northeast, closer to the Texas border, it's more available because it really shares the same pipeline configuration. But generally, utilities are higher cost, and particularly if it's a new factory, the cost to establish electric service is quite high to a new factory, and that's sort of coming from a U.S. background. That's a bit of an unexpected situation. The connection fees are quite high.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Okay. So again, the next case study. This was a manufacturer of electronic equipment, really to industrial automation, components for industrial automation, and they had large facilities in the U.S. and in China. They'd been in China operating successfully since the early 2000s, but they were faced with tariffs certainly, and wanted to look at options to do supplier searches in Mexico to avoid export of some materials and some sub-assemblies and some components from China to the U.S. Their operation in China, again, they were quite satisfied with it, and they were successfully using it to export from China to Europe and Southeast Asia, and also to supply a domestic market in China. But they're looking to get away from a significant portion of or significant spend moving material from China to the U.S. So again, it was tariffs, logistics challenges. They get crushed with freight costs during COVID certainly, and uncertain transit times. They were particularly concerned about potential for deterioration of U.S.-China relations, and again, IP protection, which continues to be a concern in China, and this had limited their ability to extend their product manufacturing to China. They were with IP-sensitive items. So we evaluate the commodity needs, and really to look particularly at metal stampings and castings and injection molding components and assembled sub-assemblies. So we identified and qualified suppliers in central Mexico primarily. As Jacob mentioned earlier, this was a good supplier base, particularly of injection molding and metalworking components, and developed and issued the appropriate RFQs to the shortlisted suppliers, and then essentially worked as an extension of their sourcing office to identify, to tabulate the bids, evaluate the suppliers, coordinated client visits to the top candidates, and eventually negotiated arrangements for injection molding, material stamping, and some sub-assembly operations. Again, this reduced the freight costs certainly by about 25%, and then similarly avoided the 25% U.S. duties on the material still coming from China. Okay, the third one was a North Carolina company, a manufacturer of outdoor recreation equipment. They have a major facility in North Carolina. And when we started working with them, they had 2 smaller operations in China. They had 3 in Thailand and 1 in Vietnam, and with a significant portion of their product line being sourced from third-party manufacturers, most of those being in China. So their customer base was almost entirely in the U.S. So tariffs were taking a big toll on their ability to export from their China operations, certainly to the U.S. And so they engaged us to help them evaluate a reconfiguration of their manufacturing base and assist with shutdown. Next slide. Okay. So in China, we worked with them to develop a shutdown plan and executed that plan to shut down 2 sites there. It went well. We got everybody severed without incident, and went smoothly. We looked at the products they were sourcing in China, and evaluated if they could be sourced Vietnam, and we found a bit of overlap there. We also spent a good bit of time in North Carolina to look at the manufacturing process to determine what was a good fit for that. They were doing a lot of injection molding work and assembly work, which was quite labor intensive. So these were both good fits for a Mexico operation. So again, we looked at RFQs for those products in Mexico and found appropriate suppliers. Next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned, the 2 China sites were shut down. We focused on injection molding primarily, metalworking components in metalworking stamping in Mexico, with estimated annual savings of $3 million, about 15% reduction there. Evaluated multiple options for relocating their injection molding, eventually injection molding and assembly into Mexico, and identified $8 million of opportunity there. Additionally, after the shutdown of China, we also looked at Vietnam to expand their capabilities there, and found that they had additional capacity, and worked with them to develop a strategy to make use of that additional capacity and actually relocate some equipment from China down to the Vietnam and operations. And in Thailand, we looked at the sites there and identified one as a shutdown candidate, and worked with them to shut that down and consolidated the remaining 2 sites. The 2 sites remaining sites in Thailand were running well, and were able to accept a fair amount of the manufacturing output from China. So we felt that was best to leave in place, as it was well established and was cost competitive with what they had been doing previously in China.
Dan, we got a question here, or 2 questions popped up. One was around the 3rd bullet. We're talking about, said evaluate multiple options for relocating all of the manufacturing, part of the manufacturing, to Mexico. And then we asked if you could explain that a little bit more. What specifically were you looking for? How did you get to the 8 million potential savings?
It was primarily labor savings. This was not a particularly utility intensive operation, so utilities were not a huge driver, so you were able to take advantage of the labor savings there, and that was the primary driver there.
And how much? What was the manufacturing amount of employees? How much were they doing in the U.S. and what were they looking at doing in Mexico?
There were about 400 employees in the U.S., and there would have been a similar number in Mexico.
Okay. Right, and then the next question was here on the contractors in Mexico for the components, the $3 million savings. The question was how long did something like that take to identify those contractors in Mexico, or how long did it take for us on that project for North Carolina?
It took about 4 months. It took about 4 months to identify suppliers, get them technical data package, work with them on how they would, the technical aspects of the transition. That took about 4 months to totally wrap that up. It takes a bit of effort to do that, and I think that's what we'll talk about in the group discussion here in a bit. Somewhat longer than you would expect based on experience in China. Again, the Mexican economy is taking off, and the manufacturing economy is taking off, so it takes a little bit longer to get things done in Mexico than in China, but yeah, in this case it was about 4 months to do that.
Okay, great. All right, so next we're going to hit the Q&A discussion. So what we've got is 2 sets of questions. We've got these 5 questions, And then we've got that are heavily on sourcing and identifying suppliers, all aspects of supply chain. And then we've got another page of questions more geared toward manufacturing questions. So I think we'll start off, and Dan and Jacob, if you'll add any comments you do in the questions. But Dan, on the first question about the realities of sourcing in Mexico and the effort to diversify supply chain from China, how is that affecting the Mexican suppliers? I know you put down a few comments here, but you could expand on that.
Well, Mexican suppliers have been for some years now fielding more and more inquiries. I imagine it's ticking up again now. So the ability to get information or get feedback is really contingent upon first, preferably having relationships with those suppliers, or second, having people locally that can visit, talk to, engage, and develop a relationship with potential suppliers. That greatly improved the turnaround time there. I guess the other reality is that the Mexican economy is much smaller than the Chinese economy. The supplier base, the breadth and depth of the manufacturing ecosystem there is less than China, so you really have to pick your spots there. Jacob, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that it's a kind of a shock to people, or it's different than what they're expecting, is in China, a lot of the factories are set up for the sole purpose of producing items for other people. In Mexico, that's not particularly the case, and it takes a little bit more convincing to produce stuff especially for export. If you have a factory in Mexico and you need components for that factory, or parts, or some stamping or whatever, if you can talk to a local supplier and you tell them you have a factory, it becomes very easy. And if you don't have that, then having someone there locally that can go visit them or have a relationship with some of the factories to help them, encourage them to consider a RFQ or consider bidding on business is very helpful, because they're distracted by a lot of other things coming in, and they're quite busy, so they don't have a lot of empty capacity anyway.
And Jacob, you found that this effort to diversify beyond China, obviously it's a lot of the Mexican suppliers are doing quite well. And when we've noticed, for a while now, right, when you're going in with new orders or you're identifying suppliers, you're talking to them, they're obviously looking for the large orders. It is more of a struggle now than it used to be, even 4 or 5 years ago, to find the right suppliers. I mean, we know them, but it's even still a struggle to get them if there's low volume, kind of high complexity orders.
And Mexico used to be very, good at doing those low volume, high complexity orders, higher margin. But now these suppliers have a lot of options, and they're looking at, this is a high volume and it's going to make a good profit. So it takes a lot more to convince them to take those other projects, and it usually takes also, having other things business that you can maybe give them to mix it in there, that they will be willing to take some of the items that they don't want to take as much to be able to get the higher volume or the more profitable parts.
100% agree with that. Dan, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, yeah, a couple of things. One of the differences you'd find, those of you that have gone through a sourcing or contract manufacturing exercise in China, one of the difference you see in Mexico. One, the Mexican suppliers they don't have a lot of experience, or it's not normal practice for them to take on development of essentially establishing a supply chain for your product. you go to China and if you deal with a contract manufacturer, they're well connected with component suppliers, and if they aren't already, they'll find them. And they're also if you need product design or engineering support for product design, you'll find that capability or Chinese suppliers will take that on in an effort to support your business. Not the case in Mexico. You got to be pretty well defined as far as your product and your sourcing of components. So it's a much more difficult exercise to take on contract manufacturing assignments in Mexico than China. Would you agree with that, Jacob?
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. And that is one of the things that, does add a little bit of complexity, that when you are sourcing for sub-assembly in China, you could just go to a company and they would figure out the small components and figure out where they could buy those locally for you. And in Mexico, they might not be very willing to do that. So you might have to help the supplier do that. So rather than just sourcing a sub-assembly, you might have to help that supplier find subcomponents and find other suppliers for things. So it can become a bigger project than you would expect, like when you were doing it in China, that you could just send them the drawings for a sub-assembly.
Yeah, exactly.
So on a question here about Mexico itself, right? And where they have a pretty substantial supply chain base and where they don't. We talked earlier, and we've been operating in Mexico since '95. We know there's certain sectors that are doing very well, certain sectors where Mexico really doesn't have a great supply chain base. And I think that's always a little bit of a surprise to people who have not been operating down there for as long as we have. But Dan, and you will put down some of the responses here. Can you all talk through this, Dan or Jacob? Dan, why don't you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the items on the left: medical devices, automotive, metal casting and stamping, and metalworking, and electronics and equipment assembly. Those are examples of manufacturing or industry sectors that are well established and have a good supplier base, good manufacturing base. On the other side, semiconductors and the process industry, steel, petrochemical, paper, and the like. Yeah, there are manufacturers in Mexico, but it is definitely not as broad or deep as you find in the U.S., for example. And much of those basic materials are imported into Mexico. And the same with electronic components, which are heavily sourced out of China and to an increasing extent Southeast Asia, but that's sort of the breakdown there. Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, I see the same thing, especially a lot of things that I've dealt with, especially a lot of metal processing, stamping, forging, different things, and there's a very good base of those that kind of stuff. But often when you get into some specialty stuff, you're either going to have to source in China or source in other places in Southeast Asia, especially if you're trying to set up separate supply bases. A lot of clients, they want to have, even if it's in Asia, they want to have a separate supply base outside of China. So different things in electronics industry, especially, you need to try to look in other regions.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And I think one of the things we found is when we've got this supply, when we're identifying suppliers, qualifying suppliers for U.S. manufacturing clients, it is critical once you go through that process and identify them, you got a customer base, you've got a supply chain base there. You really need to stay in front of that supplier quite a bit, of going through that factory when they're running orders or making sure the QC is done properly. It's good to have someone on the ground to do that with you, and not leave it with the assumption the suppliers can always be able to do it, because they are really busy right now, and you have to make sure you're protecting yourself. We had another question pop up here. It says, how about the volume of Chinese companies themselves relocating or expanding into existing operations in Mexico? So basically talking about Chinese companies that are moving into Mexico. We've heard conversations to talk about this, right? Both from in Washington, where they're concerned the Chinese are going to move in to do transshipment through Mexico to get into the U.S. Can Jacob or Dan, one of you all talk about that, but about Chinese companies going in there and what type of companies are going in there?
Seen a lot of activity in the automotive sector, certainly, and it's manufacturers, and it's in some cases setting up dedicated industrial parks to house Chinese tenant companies. You're seeing a couple of industrial zones open up in the Monterey area that are very much targeted to Chinese companies that want to enter the market, and it's really around manufacturing in North America. That's the biggest industry segment that we've seen, but certainly it's real. Those companies are very active. They struggle a bit. They struggle a bit to make inroads and understand the business culture and how to interact with both the private and government sectors, and whether it's Mexico or the U.S. to get set up. But they are very active.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of the same thing, especially the automotive industry. A lot of Chinese companies coming in, but those things I see them also a lot of Chinese companies in just general metal processing, type of industries, things like, like faucets and stuff like this, bringing that into Mexico. And those companies are having definitely much more trouble because they don't have quite the focus and, group of people there that are able to support them. So they're struggling even more. So I think especially as the Chinese companies are looking for, how are they going to deal with the tariffs and the duties? How are they going to localize within a NAFTA zone to be able to, continue to supply their customers and not have to face tariffs? A lot of different industries are considering Mexico, especially with the Chinese suppliers. But they do have far more problems than I see with European and American companies trying to do the same.
Yeah,
100% agree. Yeah. Dan, a question there about number 5 there about Mexican duties on Chinese imports. Right, we've seen the government in Mexico put on this modification of tariff. It's going to be active through, I think, 2026, April 2026. Can you talk about how if that affects U.S. companies? Because this is really geared toward Chinese imports, specifically into Mexico.
Well, if it's a U.S. company operating in Mexico and for re-export into the U.S. And not selling into the domestic market, then this shouldn't impact them. Those companies would be operating in a maquiladora, and it's essentially a duty-free operation. So they would bring in duty-free and then export to the U.S. And then U.S. would apply appropriate duties. If your domestic content, local content value add in Mexico was sufficient to qualify as produced in Mexico, then you would avoid the tariffs coming in, from China. So yeah, so what the Mexican government does with tariffs doesn't really affect if you're manufacturing to export to the U.S. Now, if you are manufacturing to supply the domestic Mexico market, well, yeah, that's gonna be an issue, and those tariffs would apply to your operation.
Yeah, and we're seeing one question that popped up, which we actually have, is number 4 about challenges of companies just trying to identify and qualify Mexican suppliers. What are the challenges of primarily U.S. European companies are having? We talked here earlier about this. So Dan, why don't you kind of elaborate on that, Jacob, if you would as well?
Well, we mentioned the increased competition and less interest in, say, smaller volume operations. Suppliers in Mexico, manufacturers in Mexico, tend to be, there are large ones certainly, but you find many that are family owned, but in certain industries, we mentioned injection molding and metal stamping and fabrication, machining. They tend to be smaller companies or family owned companies, tend to be undercapitalized. Access to capital for expansion is limited, different than what companies that operate in China would be familiar with. So they tend to be more conservative, and it's a harder route to get them to expand, to take on additional business if they don't already have the capacity in place. Jacob?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, one of the challenges often dealing with Mexican suppliers is if you would go to a Chinese supplier, okay, they're going to have empty capacity more than likely right now. And, if they didn't have the empty capacity in the past, they would potentially be willing to invest in the equipment that they would need to do that project. And there'd be a lot of local government support and loans and stuff for them to get the equipment. If you're going into Mexico, a lot of times, unless you're dealing with very large companies that are set in with good equipment, if you're dealing with more of a local company, they're not going to have deep pockets. They're not going to have an easy ability to invest in new equipment. They might not have the more automated equipment that you would see in China, where they have better access to capital. So there's a lot of challenges, and you have to look, who's in the market and who's the best option. And then there's also sometimes, that the U.S. company will help them with the machine and let them operate it or produce something for them. And that gets into what if you're doing like maquiladora type stuff, that you're just having them transform your material for you.
Yeah,
Right.
I guess the flip side is, one thing is, one of the advantages, if you're a U.S. manufacturer and you've got equipment that you'd like to relocate to Mexico, that's an easier activity than sending used equipment to other parts of the world. There are ways to do that in Mexico that are much easier than, for example, sending used factory equipment to China or Vietnam or other parts of the world.
Yeah.
Good point. Dan, would you talk a little bit about, when you're dealing with Mexican suppliers, about reverse engineering? Then we work with Chinese suppliers.
Yeah, we touched on that a few minutes ago. Regarding a Chinese supplier is much more able and willing to help with product design, or break down a product, and understand the components needed, and perhaps redesign as necessary. And that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because it works well if you're sourcing in China, but if you're trying to move that product or that know-how someplace else, to Mexico, for example, you may lose that. That know-how may have been developed in China. You may not. Many U.S. companies find they really don't have a full understanding of the how to produce the products that they're sourcing, and Mexican suppliers really don't usually have the wherewithal to work on projects to co-develop that.
Sure.
Particularly, yeah.
Yeah, I see that a lot, and it is sometimes become an issue when you have a Chinese supplier that's developed the product, and then a client will come to us with designs that are 10 years old, maybe have some notes on them, and then to be able to manufacture in Mexico, we got to clean that up ahead of time. We got we got to have, you know, clean drawings that are accurate to the current product so they could manufacture it. And if you approach them with drawings that don't match the samples and everything else, then it's going to become very increasingly difficult to convince them that it would be a good idea for them to work with you to manufacture your item.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. 100% agree with that, Jacob. Jacob, we got serious questions here on the manufacturing side, kind of leaving supply chain on the manufacturing side. Jacob, you tackle the first one about the pros and cons of manufacturing in Mexico versus the U.S., kind of the relative cost advantages. I know that we have touched on a little bit here, but if you would go ahead and address that, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are looking at Mexico because it is right next to the U.S. and that, you know, there's going to be some labor costs and there's going to be a lot less risks that there's issues that would disrupt logistics because, you know, it's very unlikely that the border between the U.S. and Mexico have any issues for trade, at least. And the other issue is I've had a couple clients that they were smaller clients and they were struggling because for them to buy 40-foot containers out of China, it was kind of a bit much for them to buy. But I've had some good success with, you know, having a Mexican supplier. Maybe they do a larger production run, but they send like one pallet at a time. And then basically the client, they have to agree to buy, you know, the full production run, but they can pay, you know, one pallet at a time. And for some smaller suppliers, that was, you know, a big advantage. And they really like that, to not have to go to China and make a big order and then have, you know, 3 or 4 months of inventory in their warehouse that they, you know, had to put their capital into. So yeah. I know a lot of companies that really, they like that. It was just so fast that they could, you know, it may be a little bit expensive, extra expensive, but you could get a container from Mexico to your factory or your warehouse in the US within a day or two. And it's you know, that was a big advantage for a lot of smaller companies, especially. And yeah, in Mexico, there are some, the utility costs are higher. Some of the raw material costs are higher. The real estate costs sometimes are a bit higher.
Yeah, one thing that's always kind of surprised a little bit is we'll get some, when we're setting up suppliers or setting up relocated manufacturing there, sometimes people are surprised about the transmission costs from Mexico up into the interior of the US, right? I mean, we've seen them in some cases compared to what it costs us to go from Bangkok or from Thailand or Vietnam back to the US. So some of those internal rates, transmission rates in Mexico can be much higher than you would have normally thought.
Mm-hmm.
Dan, any comment on that?
I don't disagree, and it's the other thing is the freight rates out of Asia are much more variable. Now, we went through a period of several years where they were quite low and then jumped up during COVID, then dropped down last year, and now they're back. You know, they've gone from $2,000 to $7,000 per container, and you know, in the last year. So there's a high, you know, there's a lot of variability in that trans-Pacific shipment. Freight rates from Mexico to the U.S. are higher than people might expect. A lot of that is dependent on the direction of flow. When the flow is balanced between the U.S. and Mexico, and the containers are, you know, the shipping vans are in balance, then freight rates tend to be a little bit lower. If it gets out of balance, then everything ends up on the wrong side of the border, and you've got to pay to bring back, you know, empty containers, and they jump up. But generally less variability in the North America logistics cost than what you see coming out of Asia.
100% agree with that. Absolutely. One of the questions we had asked earlier was about number 3 here, about other circumstances where it's maybe better off to stay in Southeast Asia or to establish supply chain or establish manufacturing in Southeast Asia rather than come to the U.S. or Mexico. And Dan, I know you put down a couple of notes here. If you would kind of touch base on that and further explain that.
Well, you know, if if you think for the long term, you're going to be wedded to a significant group of suppliers in China, and you want to stay close to them, then certainly Southeast Asia is a more appropriate option than moving to Mexico. Cost savings, particularly in labor costs, Southeast Asia is significantly less than China or Mexico, where you'd see labor costs of half of those markets, and more transparent incentives, and particularly when you talk about places like Thailand that have quite specific and central government organized incentive programs. Whereas in Mexico for sure, the incentives are very locally driven and not particularly transparent. And to a large extent in the U.S. as well, you've got a variety of incentives, relatively transparent but very local. And so you're dealing with different options by region to region, state to state. We talked a little bit about freight, but if you're in a situation where you've got a low freight cost, maybe you're shipping by air, or a month's output from your operation fits into a container or two, then and freight's not a big driver, then maybe worth staying in Southeast Asia certainly. And if your customer base is around the world and you're not overly or cripplingly staying in South impacted by tariffs, then Southeast Asia could be, staying in Asia would be a good move for you.
Absolutely. Jacob, would you add anything to that?
The only thing that I would add is this, especially if you're having a lot of difficulty getting maybe what you're trying to outsource or what you're trying to manufacture in Mexico might not be big orders or very attractive. It might be easier to do that in Southeast Asia, because there are a lot of factories in Vietnam and Thailand that are not running at full capacity. They do have spare capacity and they're actively trying to get business. In Mexico, a lot of the companies, when you talk to them, they're already at full capacity, and convincing them to expand their capacity or take on a new project sometimes very difficult. And if you can't get it in, then the alternative might be to go to other markets where they have more free capacity.
Very, very fair point. Absolutely. And we know in certain markets, like in certain industry sectors, right, the components, whether you manufacture in Mexico or in Thailand or Vietnam, a lot of those components are still coming from China, right? Mm-hmm. Particularly in the electronic sector. So, and so you're still going to have to import them from China, but then looking at your overall basis of where they're going, if they are going more global and not totally dependent on the U.S., then Southeast Asia is a good space. We do know that the Thais and the Vietnamese are really offering a lot of incentives, where the Mexican government is offering some incentives, but not to the same level of tax incentives to get you to come into Mexico. And if we go to, if we're looking up here around, one of the questions was around investment incentives in Mexico. What do they offer specifically? We know what's going on in Vietnam and Thailand. They're offering big incentives and 10 years of no taxes. Or Dan, can you talk a little bit about Mexico itself and what kind of incentives they're offering?
It's limited, and it's very local. You see things like tax holidays around payroll taxes, training subsidies, or training partnerships with local schools and local government agencies. Occasionally, you'll see for a larger investment, you may get a break on some of the utility connection fees or infrastructure improvements to support a factory. but it's limited. You won't see the high, for example, compare and contrast some place like Thailand that has that in certain industries you've got a very attractive tax holiday, income tax holiday for corporations. So yeah, it's the incentive environment. It's just not a very rich environment for incentives in Mexico at this point.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, it is 12 o'clock. We are hard stop here. I would tell you that I know we had any questions that come in now, we will answer by telephone. Everyone will be receiving a webinar survey. Appreciate you filling that out. And we'll be providing a webinar recording and the PowerPoint on the East West Associates website. And you can go there, look under the webinars, and this will be listed under the section on Mexico. And please feel free to download it if you would. But I'd like to thank Dan McLeod. I'd like to thank Jacob Miller for doing a great job speaking today, and appreciate the residents coming in and asking questions. I've made this a very good webinar. Thank you all very much and have a great day. Bye-bye.